This is PT Pro Talk, the podcast for physical therapists who want to improve their clinical skills and be more successful. I am Mariana Parks, physical therapist and your host, and today I'm joined by Professor Tim Gabbett for a conversation on load management and how we can better bridge the gap between rehab and performance. We discussed the gap between feeling rehabbed and actually being ready for performance, practical strategies for rehab practitioners to apply training principles and safely progress athletes back to sport, how training load can be both a tool for injury prevention and a risk when mismanaged, simple ways to monitor training load and athlete response, even with minimal resources, and more. Professor Tim Gabbett is one of the world's leading experts in sports science and injury prevention. With over 30 years of experience as a performance consultant to elite organizations around the globe, Tim holds 2 PhDs, one in human physiology and another in applied sports science. He has published more than 300 peer-reviewed articles, presented at over 400 conferences worldwide, and was recently named one of the top 10 most impactful sports scientists of all time in a global study published in PLOS Biology. And there is a special bonus for PT Pro Talk listeners. You can get an exclusive discount on Professor Gabbett's face-to-face workshop in Brazil or any of his online courses by using the code PTPRO2025 at checkout. The offer is valid through May 31st. You will find the links in the show notes. If you find our conversation informative, don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell for updates, give us a thumbs up, and share this episode with colleagues who could benefit from these insights. Thanks for tuning in, and now let's dive into the discussion. PT Pro Talk is only possible with the support of the forward-looking and innovative companies like
Welcome to Urban Polling. Discover the Activator program and polls for rehab and balance.
Sarah Health. Remote therapeutic monitoring sounds great, but also difficult. Sarah Health makes RTM simple and easy for your patients and providers. Check out sarahealth.com/PTProTalk for a special offer. Hi team, welcome to PT Pro Talk. How are you today?
I'm very well, Mariana. Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So let's get started just talking a little bit about yourself, your career, and potentially some things that we don't know about you.
Okay. Well, I'm a sports scientist, and for 30 odd years, I've worked in sport at the coalface of sport. So I work with coaches and athletes, with physiotherapists and strength and conditioning coaches, essentially to try and bring a team together so that athlete can achieve great things and achieve their goals. And predominantly the way I do it is through designing and applying appropriate training, making sure that athletes are training hard enough to meet the demands of their sport, that they're physically and mentally well prepared for the demands of the sport. Now, in terms of things that you may not know about me, that's a good question. I've got a wife and 3 kids. My kids are grown up now, but they're all been active in sport as well. We're a pretty active family in general. My wife and I will do lots of different stuff in terms of, we're cycling regularly, we lift regularly, we get out and hike and get in the surf a lot. But even my kids, every year I have a race. It's a 5-kilometre race against my son where we compete for a shield. And
that's awesome.
We've done that for 4 years now, and it's 2 wins apiece. And my youngest son, he lifts and is a strength coach himself. So he's quite, and he's been around it for a long, long time. He's 26 now, I think 25, 26, and he's probably got 12 or 13 years of good training experience under his belt. He's been around it a long, long time. So, we're a pretty active family.
Before we continue our conversation, I wanted to take a quick moment to present you to our sponsor, Neck Care.
Traditional neck assessment methods often fall short of providing a full picture, overlooking movement control and sensory motor integration. That's why a physical therapist developed the Neck Care system to provide reliable assessments of sensory motor integration, proprioception, and range of motion. With objective data and visual results, physical therapists can better understand neck impairments and design targeted treatment plans for optimal outcomes. If you treat neck impairment in your practice, visit neckcare.com to learn more.
And now, let's get back to our conversation. That's very good. Everybody's active. Awesome. I know that you also publish a lot of research. So how did you get involved on research and what led you to down that path?
Look, I don't think I ever really thought about publishing research. That was never really a goal for me at all. When I originally set out to study what I studied, I did set down some goals of what I wanted to achieve, and one of those things was a PhD. Without really knowing what a PhD entailed, I just thought, okay, I want to do a PhD. I want to be the best that I can be in my field. Not the best in the world at what I do, just the best that I could be. Right. So there's a slight difference in. Hopefully, you can pick up on that I'm not too interested in competition among other sports scientists, because there's no competition there. There's no championship for sports scientists, and the whole award thing for sports scientists, I think, is a bit of a joke. But it was about just pushing myself and just seeing how good I could be. That was the goal. Now, I didn't know that a PhD involved research. I had no idea really what a PhD was, but then I quickly learned that you have to do some research. So that's how I kind of fell into research. I enjoyed part of the process, and I wouldn't say I enjoyed all of it. There's some parts of research that I don't enjoy much at all, but I do like asking questions, and I do like trying to find an answer. Now that doesn't have to be test tubes and lab coats either. It can be really simple performance questions that a coach drives a question a lot of the time, and we're just trying to find an answer to that in sport, trying to find a solution. So that's really how I approach research. The writing part, the publication part, I was initially, when I started university, I would say I wasn't a strong writer. It was something that I had to really work at in order to improve, and that came down reading a lot. I read a lot of papers, just kept reading and reading and reading, and what you find is you can connect with authors that have a particular writing style, and they write really well. So you start to learn a little bit more on how to structure sentences, how to structure paragraphs, and then how to sequentially put your thoughts together. So it became a bit of a hobby for me. Writing was really just a hobby. It was something that I couldn't do very well. I taught myself how to do it, and then it became almost like a little cathartic outlet. It was relaxing for me. Now, I don't know if it's still that way, but that was pretty much how I got involved in research.
And I know you talk a lot about load management. So I wanted to ask you, what are some important concepts that we can use as physical therapists and apply in our field?
Yeah, well, look, most people think of load management in terms of the media's take on it, and particularly how it relates in the NBA. And if you believed what the media say about load management, you would think that it's all about rest. So let me get it out straight away that it's not all about rest. But load management probably started with physiotherapists in the clinic, where if we had someone with an ACL injury, for example, one of the steps or one of the strategies that we would use to bring that athlete back, to rehabilitate the injury, to bring that athlete back to their sport, was through load management. And if you think of the term load management, it's about managing the load we place on the injured tissue or the injured structure. So when you're in that acute phase of injury, where your local tissue capacity is in the floor, it's in the basement, you can't do much at all, clearly you can't handle the same loads that you could when you're healthy. So that's what load management meant from a physiotherapy standpoint when you're bringing someone back from injury. Now, that could be an ACL injury, but let's think about a tendinopathy. Load management would be about balancing load, balancing good and or correct and incorrect load. So if we think of tendinopathy, or Achilles tendon ruptures, something like that, in the early stages of those conditions, those injuries, we're eliminating the provocation. We're eliminating the activity that provokes the most soreness and the most pain. So tendinopathy, if you're a runner, then probably what we're doing is managing load, pulling back a little bit on running load. So rather than running back-to-back days, you might run every alternate day. So rather than running Monday, Tuesday, you run Monday, Wednesday. So you're reducing that type of load, but on the other hand, you're increasing loads in other areas. It could be you're really increasing the amount of isometric strength work that you do. So you're building in yielding isometrics, you're building in overcoming isometrics. So you've got this load management, which is really a balancing process, reducing the load that's going to provoke pain and increasing the load that's going to build strength and reduce pain. So that's another way you can look at load management. But essentially, what we're doing with load management is we're using well-established principles of training to bring our athletes from being injured back into a healthy state.
And we know that's super important as physiotherapists to bridge that gap, right? We are the ones that are with athletes in the rehab, and then towards the end of their rehab, we have to transition them and back to the sport, right? So what are some important things that we should be aware as physical therapists to help on that process, helping them recover quickly and safely?
Well, let's talk about when you have an injured tissue. What's at the forefront of your mind? I'll ask you first. What's at the forefront of your mind when you have an injured tissue? Let's say a hamstring. You've got a hamstring strain. What's the first thing that you want?
I want to know how much they can handle. I want to test their starting point, so I know what they can tolerate, and then progress from there.
Okay, so that's a really good point. What you're talking about there is tissue tolerance. Now, another way we can define tissue tolerance is we could call it local tissue capacity. We're talking about the same thing, just a slightly different word. So when you have an injury, whether it be a hamstring injury or another injury, local tissue capacity is going to be driven to the basement, right? You're not going to be able to do much at the hamstring because of pain. the pain is going to drive local tissue capacity down. Now, that doesn't mean that pain isn't necessarily equivalent with function, but it's in those early stages, you can't do a lot because of pain. Now, if you can't load the tissue at the local level, then there's no way in the world that you're going to be able to load it at a sport-specific level. And the example I'll give you here is if you can't do, let's say, an isometric glute bridge with a bent knee, one of the easiest, or even a double leg glute bridge with a bent knee, then if you can't do that when your athlete's injured, then there's no way you're going to be able to sprint. Right, so there's the difference between local tissue capacity and sport-specific capacity. So the first thing we need to know is, well, what can the athlete handle? But we also need to calm that tissue down before trying to build it back. And we generally build it back in steps in a progressive way. Now, the other thing I'd like physiotherapists to consider, though, is just because we return that tissue to its previous tolerance levels, or just because we improve the local tissue capacity, it doesn't mean that our job is finished. Right? What we want to try and think of is let's work a little bit longer term here. Let's not just think about that first 2 to 3 weeks where we're looking at the local tissue. Let's think of the system as a whole and look further down the track and say, well, what is it that we're preparing this athlete to do? Do we want them to be able to do a single leg isometric glute bridge with a straight leg? Or do we eventually want them to be able to sprint at maximum velocities and be able to do that repeatedly? Because even being able to do a straight leg glute bridge, it's a massive difference between here and the sprinting demands. So the second thing I'd like physiotherapists to be able to think about is the global capacity of the athlete. Now, if you can, when I talk about global capacity, I'm talking about things like, well, what are some of the capacities that athlete needs when they are competing, when they're healthy, and when that tissue is in a functional state? They might need aerobic fitness, they might need strength and power, they might need speed. These are all physical qualities that we can be working on while we're restoring local tissue capacity. So what I'm saying there is focus on the injured tissue. That's got to be our number one priority. But then train around the injured tissue. See where we can maintain global capacity around that injured tissue. So we're still being respectful of the injured tissue. We're still being respectful of biological healing time. But just because they have a hamstring injury doesn't mean we can't work on upper body strength and power. It may mean that we can't sprint, but maybe we can get them doing some higher intensity circuits or some bike work, or some ergometer work that allows them to maintain cardiovascular fitness and strength and power. Now, the goal there is the third point. That's what actually bridges the gap between being injured and returning to full performance. If you've neglected global capacity, all those extra physical qualities of strength, power, aerobic fitness, then not only do you have a local tissue problem, you've got a second problem where they've got a local tissue problem and they're unfit. So by maintaining global capacity, you give that athlete the best chance of going from being injured and then returning the tissue to a safe level, and then progressing straight back from being fit into return to play activities or return to full training activities. So that's a big one, I think, is maintaining fitness around that injured tissue, maintaining global capacity around that tissue.
And does that relate to the building the chronic load? I don't know if that's the correct term. I was reading some terms that use the acute load, the chronic load. So you have to maintain like a high chronic load. Is that related to that or not exactly?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like if let's go back to someone pre-injury. They're healthy, so they're able to train and play regularly, which means their chronic load is pretty high. Now, when you injure a tissue, that chronic load that has been tracking along really well starts to decline. And if you're not training regularly, your chronic load, which is analogous to fitness, it starts to decline. So in that injured tissue, what you're trying to, in that injured period, you're trying to build that chronic load back in a safe way, back to where it was prior to the injury. So absolutely, you're trying to build chronic load into the tissue, into the system, and we do that through regular exposures of acute load. Regular exposures with recovery periods in between, depending on the tissue. We'll have some that will be higher doses, some that will be smaller doses. In the early stages of injury, they're going to be what we would call micro doses. So they're just small regular doses of acute load, of acute training. And then as you get closer to return to play, those doses become a little bit bigger, so that you're starting to expose your athlete to the type of loads that they're going to experience in competition.
And I was reading one of your papers, like something that got my attention was you said that when progressing an athlete from rehab to peak performance, low must exceed load capacity. So that I thought that was very interesting. And then you say when gradual systematic increases in load are applied, low capacity will improve. So that's what you were talking about, like you have to slowly increase the low capacity to bridge the gap, but not too much because you don't want to cause injury. So you have to be on the right dose there. And I think that's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge for everyone. But what you're talking about there, where we're loading just a little bit more than load capacity, that's kind of one of the key principles of training that strength and conditioning coaches use, but also we should be using as physiotherapists. It's just progressive overload. So in many respects, the way physiotherapists work and the way strength and conditioning coaches work is pretty similar. We have similar principles that guide our practice, but we just work in slightly different ways. You will probably work more with athletes in the rehab end, where the strength and conditioning coach will probably work with athletes more on the peak performance end, but the similarities are there. Now, there's only two ways that I know of that you can improve load capacity. The first is the one that we've talked about, and that's progressive overload. That's just loading a little bit more than your athlete's current capacity. And I would call that front-ending capacity, where we're trying to improve capacity on the front end by loading more. But there's a second way, and I would call this back-ending capacity or propping up capacity on the back end. And it's through managing health. And it's making sure that we sleep well, we eat well, we hydrate well, we keep our stress levels low, and we have enough recovery within our sessions. But what we're trying to do is manage the response to load. And we do that through managing health. So there's only two ways that you can do it. You can front end it, you can pull the lever and front end it through load, or you can pull a different lever and back end it through health factors. Both of those things are critical because they're both going to impact capacity. And the key part with capacity is if you don't load or if you don't have health, you don't have capacity. And if you don't have capacity, you don't have performance. Right? So all of those 3 points are really important to performance outcomes. And that's kind of really important for coaches to understand as well, that health is important. And that includes all types of health, whether it be physical or mental.
And it's not just about load. So that's one thing that people might think is just all about load, but you forget about all the health management that you're mentioning. So that's really important. And you also mentioned response to load. So how do you monitor that response? How do you know how they are doing with that load?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one as well, because there's a lot of subjective and objective ways to do it. So that if you think about the objective ways, what we're really talking about is probably a whole range of technologies. And those technologies could be something like if we want to know whether an athlete is adapting in a cardiovascular sense, then we might do a submaximal exercise test. Let's say it's a submaximal yo-yo test, where they do 4 minutes of the yo-yo test at a submaximal level, and then we look at heart rate recovery. And that could be done on a bike as well, at a standard work rate, submaximal work rate. We can think about it in terms of some of the stuff we can do on force plates with something like a counter movement jump, and or we can use upper body tests as well. But what we're looking at is neuromuscular function. So using that test as some sort of measure of neuromuscular function. Some people would use HRV as a measure of response. Now you need that tracking on a regular basis, but if your heart rate variability changes significantly, then that might give you an indication of adaptation. So there's kind of some technologies that give you objective measures of response. There are other ways, though, if you don't have all the technology and you have a limited budget, which is for the vast majority of people that we come in contact with, they don't have those technologies. So subjective markers can be pretty good as well. So what we generally have is anywhere from 3 to 5 questions that we ask our athletes on a regular basis, and we get them to rate how they're feeling on a 1 to 5 scale. So it could be a 1 to 7. And this is where it becomes a little less standardized, but generally I use a 1 to 5 scale where 1 is feeling terrible, never felt worse, and 5 is never felt better. So it could be something like stress, sleep, mood, soreness, and energy or fatigue. You've got 5 questions there. And that will give you an indication of how an athlete is responding to the load that you're giving them. If you've got a specific tissue that you're working on, so those questions are kind of geared towards the system. How are you feeling as a whole?
Mm-hmm.
But if you've got an injured tissue, then you might just have to change those questions slightly. So let's say we've got a tendinopathy. We've loaded on day 1. You bring them back on day 2. How does it feel today? Oh no, it feels really good. Okay, well let's just give it one more day. Let's see how it's feeling on day 3. Is there still pain? If I put a bit of pressure on the tendon, is there pain there, or is that pain subsided? So you can just change those questions a little bit to meet the needs of your to understand the tissue response.
And then from there, you're going to decide if you did too much load or too little load. So what are you looking for? What is the optimal response that you're looking for?
Okay, well, see, optimal loading is going to is going to be a little bit of a moving target in some ways, because optimal load for one phase of the season. Well, let's talk about across the season. Optimal loading in pre-season could look very different from optimal loading once you start playing games, which could look completely different once you're going into the championship game, right? So in pre-season, loading tends to be really high. You tend to be never truly in a recovered state, never in a optimum state to receive doses of load, because you're just training so hard. But once the preseason finishes and you get into season, the game takes so much out of you. You need to be well prepared going into the game, and you need to be giving yourself enough recovery out of the game. So the training loads tend to drop. You tend to be nowhere near as fatigued throughout the week, although you tend to have some fatigue in the days following a competition. And then when you go into a championship game, optimal loading looks a little bit different, because you want to go into that game feeling fit but feeling really fresh and ready to perform. So you don't want to be feeling tired and fatigued going into that game. So optimal loading looks different across the season, but it also looks different from athlete to athlete, in that some athletes can handle really high training loads, and perhaps their response doesn't change too much. They bounce back very quickly in response to that load. Whereas other athletes, you might expose them to lower loads, but their response is much poorer. So optimal load for one athlete is different from another athlete. But it's important to understand what you're trying to achieve with adaptation. That will help you if you understand what you're trying to achieve at a given point in time. Then that will drive the kind of response, the expected response. What am I expecting to see here? And then that will drive, well, how much load do I need in order to get that response? Now, it makes it sound like, oh, well, it's really easy to optimal load. In my mind, it's not easy. But part of getting to some level of peace with it all is to accept that in order to optimal load, you could be optimally loading one tissue or system and suboptimally loading another. Right? Now, this is you could be optimally loading, let's say, a muscle, and you're preparing it for high-intensity eccentric activity. That might take you 72 hours in between doses. If you do it on Monday, you're probably not going to be able to do something similar to that until Thursday. But it might even take you longer than that. But if you think of other tissues, let's say cartilage or tendon, where we can load more frequently than that. So what that tells us is what we should be trying to do is identify the limiting tissue. What is the most vulnerable tissue at play? If it's a hamstring injury, that's the most vulnerable tissue, so that dictates our loading schedule. If it's a tendon, then the recovery times for tendons tend to be a little bit shorter. Not too much shorter, but a little bit shorter, which means that we're probably looking at a 48-hour loading schedule. If we've got cartilage, then that's shorter again. We can recover quite quickly. The cartilage adapts, deforms and reforms quite quickly in response to walking and running. So the recovery windows there are different from tendon and muscle. But the trick here is identify the most vulnerable tissue, and then get your loading schedules in line with the most vulnerable, and accept the fact that optimal loading for one tissue might mean suboptimal loading for another. And if you get to that point, and you're feeling less stressed and it's okay, that's exactly what I'd hope most practitioners to get to, that optimal loading means different things for different tissues.
And that becomes a little complex as you start to break that down.
Well, just on that, my most recent paper, which is one I'm really happy with, is basically discusses this. But it took me 8 years to write it. And like if you talk to anyone about writing publications, if you told them that it took you 8 years to write a paper, they would think you were crazy, right? But that's how long it had been going around in my head. Well, isn't optimal loading optimal loading? Isn't optimal loading for one tissue the same for another? But then when I sort of came to a point where this calmness came over me, and it was like this peaceful feeling of actually it's not, and that's okay. That optimal loading for one tissue may mean suboptimal loading for another. And once you get to that point, it takes a lot of the pressure off you as a practitioner. You go, well, let's make the main thing the main thing. And the main thing at the moment is restoring the capacity of the injured tissue. And then we will build a program around that.
Yeah, focusing on the most limited factor first and then build from there. And I think another point is that a lot of therapists are afraid of loading. For example, a muscle injury, right? And I saw in one of your papers, like you saying that if you compare people waiting 2 days after the injury versus 9 days after, you shorten the return to play by 3 weeks without increasing the risk of injury. So I think sometimes that's one of other big things for therapists. Sometimes you're afraid of loading too quick, too much, and we might be losing a few weeks there that are important for an athlete in that case.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I might have mentioned that in one of my papers. That study wasn't mine. That was a study by Bayer, and it's a great study to draw on. She's done some other great work as well, and others have kind of built on that work. Now, there's a couple of things in there as well that the papers around is a comparison of early versus delayed loading. But keep in mind that on day two post injury, they're not going out and making their athletes sprint. They're still loading relative to that athlete's capacity at that point in time. So if the capacity is low, they're just loading a little bit more than that athlete's current capacity. And it did take, in the return to play process, it did take quite some time to get both groups back to playing again. So I would say probably in that study that the rehab programs in both groups were quite conservative compared to what we see in a sporting sense, where there's a lot more pressure on us to get athletes back quickly. But in saying that, it's a great study. It's well cited, and it's a pretty clear indication that loading and loading early tends to be key in bringing an athlete back quickly. And there's a lot of other spin-off studies from that around subsequent injury as well, that if you can load and load early and build chronic loads, it actually sets your athletes up to stay injury-free for longer. You can't guarantee that they'll never get injured, but you reduce the risk of subsequent injury.
And what are some signs that would make you think that was too much load? For example, okay, we think about let's start loading quicker, and the next day they're super sore. Do you go about pain level? You mentioned those questionnaires. And like in the clinic, what would be a good way for clinicians to track that? Would be their pain level, or like how do you go about that? Any suggestions?
Yeah, well, look, I think if you take someone on day one of pre-season, even if they're healthy, and then assess their level of soreness on day 2 and day 3, chances are, even if they've managed to keep themselves fit and strong in the off season, they're probably going to feel a little bit of soreness on day 2 and 3. It's just part and parcel of getting back into training. Now, if you take someone who's been injured and has never really trained before in their life, and you give them some training to do, they may feel the same way. They may feel really sore because it's like this new feeling. So that, a level of soreness is okay. Typically, we would work on if you've got enough data and you're capturing that soreness on a regular basis, then something like 1.5 standard deviations below normal, you might say, oh, geez, that's a bit more soreness than I thought. Equally, you might find the opposite, that if they're 1.5 standard deviations above, you go, well, look, they're coping with this training load really easily. So there's a little bit, you can use the numbers, but I think we shouldn't downplay the importance of getting to know the person in front of us as well. Looking at body language, listen to their breathing, look at their facial expressions. Do they have a reluctance to go into end ranges with the exercises that we're prescribing? All of these things can give us an indication of how they're tolerating the training right at that point in time. So before we even get to the following day or the following 2 or 3 days, we've got a pretty good indication of where that training load is sitting. We can dial external load, the load that we give them on that day. We can dial it up or we can dial it down depending on the feedback they give us while they're doing the exercise. And if they're really struggling with the exercise, then we can dial it back a little bit. So rather than doing single leg heel raises with no support, maybe we get them doing single leg heel raises and they're holding on to a bar. And if they still can't do that, okay, well let's go back a step. If they can't do single leg heel raises holding onto a bar, let's try double leg heel raises. How does that feel? Oh, the double legs are easy. All right, let's put a little bit of load. Let's add a little load to your double leg. And so you can play around a little bit to try and find the right dose. And a little bit of soreness is okay. I think setting some expectations with your athlete or patient that, when you come in here, we're going to be doing some work. You might feel a little bit of fatigue in the tissue, whatever tissue you're working in, and it might feel a little bit of soreness or a little bit of pain. A little bit of pain is okay. We're kind of chasing that at times. We actually want to get a little bit of that. So don't be afraid of that. I'm gonna look after you. You're going to be okay with me. You might feel a little bit sore tomorrow, but then when we come back and do it the next time, you won't be anywhere near as sore. You'll be feeling a lot better just through this one session. So setting some realistic expectations around that pain and soreness and fatigue, and that it's not necessarily, it doesn't indicate danger or damage, that they are safe. I think that's pretty important in the process as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to ask about some training principles. What do you think some of these principles that are important for rehab practitioners to understand, and how they can build that into their rehab programs?
Well, look, I think we've already talked about a few. We've talked about progressive overload, just loading a little bit more than your athlete's current capacity. We've talked about individualization, that the same load can bring about a different response for two different athletes. So we try and We try and individualize training as much as possible. Specificity is a really important principle in that a tissue or a system will adapt to the specific demands that are placed on it. So if you progressively load a tissue, it will adapt to it and it will get stronger. And equally, if you don't expose that tissue to regular doses of load, it'll adapt in a different way. It will maladapt. It will go backwards. Reversibility is important. So essentially, if you don't use it, you'll lose it. Recovery is important. That in order to get appropriate adaptation, you have to build recovery windows into your training. And those recovery windows are tissue and system dependent. So the recovery you need following a high intensity interval session is completely different, or sprint session is completely different from the recovery you need between low intensity, long, slow running session. And then the final one that I like to talk about is variation. And this is probably a key one for physiotherapists to understand, and they can actually work with strength coaches, strength and conditioning coaches to build really good rehab and return to play plans. So variation is not it's not variety. When I'm talking about variation, I'm not talking about variety. I'm not talking about just doing very novel, unusual exercises. What I'm talking about is when you expose an athlete to load, you're having highs and lows throughout the week. And those highs and lows generally are tissue and system dependent. So what I'm thinking about is I want to expose my athlete to high intensity tasks so that they're prepared for the demands of competition. But I also want to expose them to low intensity activity so that they can recover and adapt from those high intensity sessions. So in that respect, the high stress day, the high intensity session, is your training stimulus. The low stress day or the recovery day is where you get your adaptation. They work hand in hand. High stress, low stress. And for most sports, if we take an endurance sport for an example, a 10K runner, the vast majority of their training will be low stress. It will be done at intensities that are below threshold. The high stress days, generally I would only do 2 of these in a week, possibly 3, but they're separated by much greater recovery. Generally I would allow 48 to 72 hours recovery, more often 72 hours recovery. And the goal is you want to try and keep your low days low so that you can make your high days higher. If you try and train hard every day, what happens is that low day starts to become a little bit higher intensity. And then when you go back and do a higher intensity day, because you've under-recovered on your low day, it drags that high day down. So you end up with a whole heap of junk training rather than having a polarized model where you have big highs and big lows. You just have a whole heap of junk training that's in the middle. It's kind of moderate intensity where you're not training hard enough as a stimulus and you're not recovering well enough to adapt. So the last point I'll make about this is these high-low models you probably won't use, at least from a local tissue perspective. You're not going to use them early in rehab because the tissue just can't handle the high load stress, that high intensity stress. So in those early phases, local tissue loading is probably more around micro doses. It's just regular exposures to low intensity doses of load. But that doesn't mean that we can't train around the injured tissue in a polarized way. So we can do other activities that could be a high-low model. So your local tissue is microdoses. Everything else, being respectful of the tissue, everything else could be a polarized model. As you progress along the continuum from being injured to returning to peak performance, that microdose approach becomes more polarized, and it becomes a more true high-low model, so that when you return to sport, you have this seamless integration back into sport. You've introduced them to high-intensity stress. You're starting to build in recovery periods so that they're well prepared for the training that's about to come, which then better prepare for the competition that's about to come.
Yeah, no, that's great advice, thinking through these lenses, because sometimes we just focus on the injured tissue. We are not thinking much about everything else. And I'm sure probably in sports teams, they have PTs or strength conditioning trainers that are thinking about all of that, right? But I think it's a good concept for us to just think about when we are rehabbing an athlete. That would be super important.
Yeah, well, look at what it probably does is allows you to, it makes sense that when you have an injury, your primary focus is the injured tissue. But what it allows you to do is keep one eye on the injured tissue, but also have forward, what does this athlete need to do when they go back to sport? So you're starting to join this a little bit more, rather than just focusing on, I need to get them out of pain. Well, that's part of it, but just being pain-free does not mean you're ready to return to sport. So it allows you to take a step back and look at the injured tissue, but take a step back and look at the program as a whole and see where they are now compared to where they need to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I wanted to ask you, I don't know if that's relevant for rehab or not, but I saw a lot of, you mentioning this a lot of your papers and discussions about the acute and chronic workload ratio. Is that, I don't know if you want to talk just a little bit about the concept. Is that relevant for physical therapies or more just for performance?
Well, look, essentially what we're talking about there is progressive overload. What we're saying is in order for your capacity to improve, and I've used chronic load as a measure of capacity, what you're able to do over a long period of time gives you an indication of what you might be able to handle tomorrow, right? So chronic load is like capacity, and acute load is the load part of the load-capacity relationship. In order to improve capacity, or in order to improve chronic load, you need to load or have your acute load a little bit higher than your athlete's current capacity. What we know that's important to improve capacity. That's one of the ways we improve capacity. The challenge, though, is when we throw excessive acute loads at the capacity, so that load is much greater than our current capacity. And that's where the ratio comes in. It just gives us an indication, well, what is the load that we're applying today or in this week compared to what that athlete has been prepared for over a longer period of time. We're asking the question, is the athlete prepared for the load we're about to give them? And of course, the individualization, that individuality principle kind of dictates whether that athlete is prepared for it as well, because some athletes will handle large jumps in load or large spikes in load relative to capacity, others won't. So it's about trying to find who are the athletes who can tolerate it, who are the athletes who can't. So it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach there. But that is one way for you to look at loading relative to capacity. Are we actually loading when we say that we're loading, or is the load we're applying, is it actually an unload? Are we deloading the athlete and then detraining them? And then when we load them, is it a lot of load relative to their capacity, or is it a little bit of load relative to their capacity? So they're the kind of things that you're thinking about, and the ratio between acute and chronic load allows you to visualize that as a number and how that's progressing over time.
Mm-hmm. So like, let's see if I understood it. So you're always trying to give them a little bit more load than what they've been doing over time. So you're always trying to develop their capacity, increase their capacity of handling load. And then what happens when they get to like a higher level that's a lot harder to increase that acute load? So how do you go there?
Well, look, there's 2 points. You said, so you're always trying to do it. Well, not always, right? So there will be some weeks where you intentionally unload your athletes, and we do that to get super compensation. Super compensation is just adaptation. So we load, and then we might unload in order to get and able to adapt and be able to handle higher loads down the track. Now, the second part of your question is, well, what happens when chronic load is really high? Well, at some point in time, every person is going to have a hard ceiling that you can't physically put any more training load on that athlete. And let's think about an ultra endurance athlete. They've got to do a swim, bike, and run marathon, and they're training, let's say, 30 or 40 hours a week. If you ask that athlete, well, can you train any harder to improve your capacity? They will probably say, I don't know where I can fit it. I don't know where I can fit any more training, any more load. But then the second question you ask them is, well, do you want to improve capacity? Of course, they're going to say, yeah, I definitely want to improve capacity. I just don't think I can train anymore. So we go back to, well, how do you improve capacity? You can either do it on the front end through progressive overload. Well, there's no more training time, so we can't do that. So the only other option to improve capacity for that athlete is to manage the health factors. We're trying to minimize their stress, maximize recovery, get their hydration and nutrition and soft tissue work done. We're doing all of those things to try and prop up capacity as best we can. And the reality is, once you get to high chronic loads, you probably don't really need the acute chronic ratio anymore, because you're healthy and you're just rolling along at a high level with natural highs and lows within your week. A well-planned training schedule will take care of most of the progression challenges. Then you may not even progress loads in that sense. You might just hold the load constant, and all you're trying to do is just regulate load throughout the weeks by having some high days and some lower days, and you're getting resilience and robustness through consistency of training, as opposed to any progressions or regressions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think these concepts are super interesting, even that we might not use in our day-to-day. I think it's important that we understand these things to also help our patients and be able to advise them and help them in that sense.
Well, look, yeah, I mean, I think most people, when they think of athletes, they think of the top end. They think of elite level football players or elite level triathletes. But if you reframe it and you stop referring to the people who come into your clinic as patients, but think of them as athletes, the principles of rehab for an 80-year-old grandmother is exactly the same principle as what you would use for an endurance athlete. It's just that the absolute load that you apply is slightly different. You're looking for progressive overload. You're still looking for individualization and specificity, some variation in the training stimulus, recovery periods. All of those principles are the same. So in actual fact, your 80-year-old patient is just an older athlete, right? You think of patients as athletes, and I can almost guarantee you, if you start referring to them as athletes, they will start feeling better straight away. About themselves. They'll start feel their mindset will change. Their mindset towards training will change.
Yeah, that's a good point. Team, before we go to the final questions and wrap up, anything that we forgot that you think it's important? Any messages that you want to say here for the physical therapist, the audience? Anything else?
Oh, look, I think we've covered a fair bit of stuff. What I will say though, because I know that you're originally from Brazil, I'm going to be going to Brazil in August, and I'm going to run a 2-day workshop for physical therapists and fitness coaches. Anyone who's involved in the rehab and training process will have live translation, English to Portuguese translations, so no one will get lost.
Nice. Yeah.
So that is going to be on the 2nd and 3rd of August. And I haven't been to Brazil in a long time, for maybe 5 or 6 years, but I've always had a great time when I was there and always welcome there. So if any of your audience is from Brazil, keep an eye out for it, because that one will be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I do have a lot of listeners from Brazil. So where is the course going to be? Do you remember?
Yeah. Now, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it's Belo Horizonte.
Yes, Belo Horizonte. Yes.
Okay.
Yep, you got it. So yeah, let me know. Share with me so I can put on my social media as well. So I know I have a lot of Brazilians that follow me, so that would be good to spread the word.
Sao Paulo as well the week before, but hopefully we'll be able to announce that soon. But we'll definitely be doing one on the 2nd and 3rd.
Okay, that's awesome. Awesome. And if people want to learn more about the topic, any resources that you recommend them to go to?
Yeah, look, there's depending on how they learn. Like the papers, they can ask for as many papers as they like, but papers can be a bit of a slog to get through at times. So I have a couple of online courses that are available that in fact, if what we might do for all of April is anyone who listens to your podcast, and we can create a unique code for them, and that will give them a discount for April. So maybe what we'll do is in offline, I'll share a discount code for you, and you can put that in the notes as well.
Yeah.
And they can always reach out to me. Occasionally I put some stuff on social media as well. I'm just latest papers or where I'm going to be at a given point of time. But the final one is YouTube. Like I've got a YouTube channel, so there's different short clips that around some of these topics that we discussed today that they can have a look at as well.
Awesome. And I saw on your website you have a list of papers that you publish, so that was helpful, separated by different topics and sports. If people are interested, you have a list there. You have information about your course as well. It's online, and now I saw that it has translations to Spanish as well, right?
It has, yeah. I've been trying to. I'd love to get it to a lot of different, translated into a lot of different languages, but to do it, I've got to do it instead.
It's a lot of work.
Well, it's more the cost, really. It costs a lot to do it. So And things are just going through the roof. So in terms of cost, so I'm trying to get it there, but I've just got to do it in steps, unfortunately.
Next one could be Portuguese.
Well, it's probably a good plan. I'd like to be able to do that if I could.
Yeah. That's awesome. If people want to contact you, reach out to you, they can go to your website. Any other way?
Yeah, look, I think I'm a little bit old school, so the email is probably the best approach. But in saying that, I get a lot of people contacting me through Instagram, just DMs on Instagram, so that's okay too. I'm generally in the field a lot, so if I see it and I don't respond straight away, it doesn't mean I'm not going to respond. I will respond. It's just that I'm a little bit slow, and I need to move away from the sport that I'm with at that point in time, and then once I get back to the office, I can follow up with emails or responses.
Awesome. Tim, thank you so much for coming here, accepting my invitation, and sharing all your knowledge with us. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks very much. I've enjoyed talking to you as well, and learning some things around rehab and how we can all work together a little bit better. So yeah, I appreciate the opportunity.
That's all for today's episode of PT Pro Talk. We hope you enjoyed this discussion. Be sure to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts, so you'll be notified when we release future episodes. You can also join our email list at ptprotalk.com to receive updates and access new episodes. If you have ever gotten value from the show, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star review. It always makes my day, and it really helps us out. If you have any guests or topics you'd like to see on the show, let us know by answering a quick survey. You can find the link in the show notes, along with more information about our guests, resources, website, and social media. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.